Welcome to the Igniting Impact podcast, brought to you by Public Knowledge. I'm Stacey Moss, your host and president of a management consulting firm. Our firm's vision is to be a catalyst for change, leaving each person, project, client, colleague, and community better than when we started. The Igniting Impact podcast is an opportunity to share what our clients and our partners do daily to make a difference in the world, and this season's theme is all about change. Change is everywhere. It's in our work, in our systems, in our communities, and within ourselves. This year, we are looking at ways to approach, manage, and adapt to change on our projects, teams, and in our organizations. Today, I welcome two of our guests to the podcast from Public Knowledge. We have Naomi Snodgrass, who's the Vice President of Management Consulting, and Ron Puent, who's our Systems Practice Director. Thank you both for joining me today. Let's start by getting to know you each just a bit more. And Ron, if you don't mind starting, the first question I want to start with is just tell us a bit about your professional background and what you do for work today.
Sure. Thanks, Stacey. So my background, I've got an electrical engineering undergrad. So I started off as an engineer. I really enjoyed software development during my master's. And so after getting my MBA, I went into software development with a company and redeveloped the eligibility system in Georgia for their public assistance. That led to a software development job in Colorado on their Medicaid system. I stayed with that firm for about 17 years and moved around in different positions. And I was actually able to set up a PMO, a project management office, from scratch. Those weren't all really popular back in the day. So that was a great experience. And I used a lot of that information and knowledge to apply to what I do here at Public Knowledge. I've been here about 7 years. Oh, and what I do. I'm a management consultant, but I'm also the Systems Practice Director. I manage projects. I'm analyst on projects. I really love being able to jump back and forth and do all of the above. As a Systems Practice Director, I'm really open to opportunities with helping with business development and training and subject matter expertise in different areas. Helping other projects in the systems realm, doing content development, both for our website and the hub. We're kind of writing our own book, of course, with a lot of oversight and guidance, but it's really exciting to do these jobs.
Thanks, Ron. All right, Naomi, tell us a bit about your background and what you do for work today.
Essentially, I have been fortunate enough to be in the management consulting field pretty much my entire career, in the area around health and human services with systems primarily. So that's why the conversation today is really exciting to me. I like to tell this part of the story. I got my very first management consulting job many years ago through an ad in the newspaper, if that gives you any indication about how many years ago. And what that allowed me to do is I stepped into a place that I found my footing, and it was really fit for me. I love the opportunity to be on a different type of project as you switch from project to project, taking what you learn from one, making it better the next project, building on each other, working with tons of different kind of people, clients, coworkers, colleagues, folks in the industry. And so I've been really doing that. I did have a few little journeys away from consulting in the same area around health and human services, working for a hospital network that set up provider offices in their network. And I did the training, which was a really great thing to bring back to my management consulting. And then at one point, I also worked for a state health plan as well and doing training. And so, basically, I like to say I've done the consulting side, I've done the kind of the payer side or the state side as well as the provider side. So that I think all that has brought me to a good understanding of kind of the space around Medicaid and health and human services specifically. I've done this my whole career, and what I get to do now in my role is really exciting to me because after so many years in a career, to be able to say you're excited about going to work every day and still doing your job, I think that's really special. And what I get to do in my role is I feel like we're kind of an internal consulting team, if you will. We support the interactions of all of our consultants as they deliver services to our clients across the board in any of the service areas that we have, any of the industries that we have. And, through methodologies, through training, through kind of advising and just kind of sharing the knowledge that's accrued over the years, many, many years. And I'm getting to overflow that to other folks. So that can be, useful to them and they're going to add to it and even make it better. So that's what I do now.
All right. Well, looking at our theme for this year about change, I'm curious what principles or values shape how you approach change in your life, either personally or professionally.
I love this question, and we do face a lot of change in what we do and how we help clients, and it's made me think back to really what's shaped my principles and values. And I think it was growing up as an Air Force brat and having to kind of pick up and move and accept the change and adapt. And so, from a young age and throughout most of my childhood, that was kind of my life. And so, I really see how that definitely rolls into the need for adaptation. And when there is change, you have to have some type of solid principles to rely on. And I think that's why organizational change management, OCM practices are so important with change. It kind of sets the ground rules, sets the expectations, and a path forward. So I'd say, yeah, just from an early time and all the way through my career, moving around with different jobs. And in PK, we're such a dynamic company, and we help clients with such dynamic issues and problems and solutions. It's fun and changes everywhere. That's where I'm coming from.
I always find any kids that come out of the military, they're resilient, right? Like, and they can get along with anyone, right? Because you just had to kind of, like you said, like pick up and move and start all over. Yeah. All right, Naomi, what about you? What principles or values shape how you approach change?
Well, I think probably now my answer might be different than it would have been 25 years ago. But, ultimately, it's don't be afraid of change. And I think I'm able to say that because I've come through so many changes. And even if the change is the most horrible experience in the world, you know what? At the end of the day, I don't ever regret going through the things I've gone through because they ended up giving me a lesson, something insightful about myself, something that I can help someone else with. So change is kind of this rolling cycle through life, if you will. And we can't be afraid of it, and we can just get something out of it, and we can deal with the parts that we can control, and the other parts, let's not worry about. That's really kind of what I bring to that thinking right now in my life.
Well, thank you both for sharing a little bit about yourselves. So, today our topic is best practices for planning on large system replacements. So, things like alternatives analysis, market research, and business process redesign. So, I thought we would start and talk real quick about what they are for the audience who may not be familiar with them and why they are important during the planning phase for a large IT system replacement. Let's just take one at a time, if that's all right. Naomi, do you want to introduce kind of what the alternatives analysis is and why that's important to the planning phase?
Absolutely. So, alternatives analysis is basically what it sounds like, right? It's looking at all the alternatives that are available in any particular decision, whether it's to get a new system or to decide on a new strategy for, staffing or whatnot. It's essentially giving a voice to all the key players, all the decision makers, anybody who has input. It allows that voice and that input to be on the table. The alternatives analysis process is essentially a way to get consensus with the voices heard. And it is an amazing when we get into the details. What I love about it is it actually really works. It actually works from a qualitative and quantitative perspective for the best decision and a decision that people can be bought into. That's really part of the process. You can't just have somebody out there with a voice saying, this is what we're doing. Well, and we see that a lot. It works way better when we get buy in on the alternative that's been selected at the end of the day through a process of analyzing the pros and cons, the impacts and the risks, and surrounding the most important things to the situation.
And I think the other thing that I find so useful about the why about alternatives analysis is all of that can be used to justify funding and justify the project too, right? I think that's a huge benefit of it. Ron, do you want to take on market research or BPR?
Market research, I think that's what we refer to as an environmental scan. At least that's what I've called it when I've managed those types of projects. And really, it's looking at the market. It's looking at what other clients are doing. It's looking at new and innovative solutions and bringing those back to your client. And usually it's in a report or a presentation to give them the options of what's out there, so that they're not trying to make a decision on what they're going to purchase in a vacuum or just based on some narrow focus. So again, it is we're not throwing crazy names at these things. That's exactly what it is. Or you're looking at the market, you're doing research, and you're bringing back intelligence to your client.
Yeah, some of the times that we've done market research, not just about what's out there and what's innovative and what's new, but also lessons learned from other places that have done something similar and brought those back to the clients before they begin, I think is super helpful too, right? Because you can learn so much from someone who's just been through something similar.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think in my mind, those lessons learned come out more in the business process reengineering because you're looking for what to do differently, what not to repeat, where's the workflow snag, where are the inefficiencies and that kind of thing. So again, the BPR, business process reengineering or redesign, that could be either formal or informal. It could be a formal documentation of their as-is processes and a full report on that, and pointing out where there are the pain points or the inefficiencies or the gaps. But we also do them more kind of informally sometimes with just, here are your pain points as you're identifying things you want in your new procurement. How would you change that in the new contract? Or how would you put that in your RFP so that not repeating those things that you don't want to have happen? And that's kind of a reengineering in a less formal standpoint.
Yeah, so the why behind that you just articulated, I totally agree with, to make sure you don't have the same problems in the new system.
Right.
Naomi, any other whys behind why BPR is helpful in that planning phase?
One of the things that I think is a little bit, it's an add-on, but also very related to what Ronnie just said is essentially we're talking about, we have a system director, that's what you are, right? But systems are basically in service to the organizational processes that the people have to engage in. So when you know what your business process should be, taking the time up front, and we'll talk about that from a planning perspective, knowing what your process is, what do you need to achieve, and then how can the system support you in doing that is really key to thinking about it the right way, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think often we see clients do the as is and identify the pain points, like you said, Ron, like before they procure. Then they procure and they build, and in that they do the to be.
Right.
And I feel like that, in some ways that sets them up for so many problems because they're letting the system drive the practice,
Yeah.
right? And the practice drive the system. So I love it when the clients are willing to actually do the as is and to be of the business process redesign before they get to procuring that system, like in that planning phase, because then they're allowing that the program, right, and the needs and what the families or kids or communities that they're serving drive what that system needs to support. And it makes it so much easier for a vendor to know what that system needs to do if they've actually done that work up ahead. So it's going to save money and time during implementation as well.
And really, the feds are pushing for identifying outcomes way early now, even as they develop their advanced planning documents. And so those outcomes are being defined now more so than I've seen in the past for the procurements. What do you want the system to do? And what needs to change for it to happen? I think we are actually moving in the right direction, and the feds are being a good force for that change.
If we think about our process, the alternatives analysis very often can take inputs from the environmental scan, from the as is and the to be business process view. And those can be inputs actually in the alternatives analysis. So you're really, again, when we think about what the alternatives analysis offers, as Stacey mentioned, it's kind of the why of the project, or it helps you explain the project throughout the life of the project. Everyone can say, aha, here's the reason we did this. We're all on the same page. And it's just, there's such a value in that.
Yeah, so I love all the whys that we've identified. We'll probably identify more as we go, but I think often I've seen clients start a large system project with, okay, let's write the procurement, let's write the requirements, right? And they kind of like just skip right over the planning phase, and it can cause lots of issues downstream, right? So what I wanted to do was talk about some of those issues. So in your experience, like what happens to projects that don't do anything in the planning phase, or they don't spend enough time in the planning phase?
So you end up with the same system they had, or a worse system, really. You have to plan and plan for change and what needs to change to better your outcomes. So that's exactly what happens. Your workforce doesn't learn new things. They stagnate on their abilities. You end up with unsatisfied federal partners, unsatisfied client communities, members using the program. It can be pretty devastating if you don't take on a lot of these steps that we're talking about today.
Yeah, Naomi, anything else?
I mean, there's kind of a mantra that we've always tried to get our clients to buy into. And sometimes we get a little closer, or sometimes they just do what Stacey said and jump right in. But the more time you spend on planning, the less time you're going to have problems later. There is probably an actual kind of best practice ratio around that. and I confess I didn't bring it to this call, but the point is, it's kind of like when you're getting ready to paint your house, right? If the more time you spend taping the proper way, the painting is going to go really smoothly. And you spent a lot of time on that taping, but the outcome is going to give you what you want in a much easier manner, and it's going to be a higher quality. Planning leads to quality, and it definitely the detriment to the organization is you don't necessarily know. Like Ron alluded to training and just folks working the system. How do they know what to do? You got to know. Training is impacted. Obviously, efficiencies are impacted. Sometimes just buy-in and attitude, basically folks not even accepting the system, which is a huge detriment to a successful implementation, no matter how amazing a system will be, if folks aren't, and bought into it, and so they won't accept it. So all of that planning, it's so important. And we've seen clients do more of it. We recently worked with a client where they actually did a to be and an as is, or an as is and a to be business process review before even the funding request went to the feds, and then before the RFP. And by the way, the RFP for that client was accepted right away with no changes. We've seen them where they jump right in, and you know what? It's just you're getting the same old, and people are not excited about what's happening.
So true. And yeah, I agree with you, Ron. You can almost always end up with a system that's exactly the same, maybe a different, look and feel, and that's about it. And your workforce is not. They'll see right through that. They're like, wait, why did we just spend $1 billion on a different look but the same problems? Or you end up with something completely different that doesn't actually work with your processes.
Yeah.
You never actually identified them for the vendor. All right. Well, the other thing that I think planning does is help you with change management down the road, right? So I'm wondering how these activities, so alternatives analysis, market research, and BPR, help people prepare for major changes like this.
I'll start. My biggest thing around organizational change management is communication. And so, like, if you know this consistent messaging and the consistent why of the project that we've already alluded to, I've been with projects where we'll be down the road into the procurement and someone will say, hey, why did we decide on this again? And if you have done a complete, thorough alternatives analysis, you can refer back to that and say, hey, here's what happened. This was the right answer out of all the options considered, and here's where we are today. And so that helps with messaging, right? It helps you set kind of a vision and that you can share out to the organization. BPR obviously gives, voice to folks who are kind of contributing to their daily work. They see that represented again as part of buy-in, as communication. And environmental scan again as an input. You're actually building a system that's incorporating improvements that maybe you didn't even know you needed, but they're out there. Other states or clients have done them more efficiently. So again, if you're able to have specific words to use in your communication strategies as you're engaging in a new system, that's kind of a big win for helping with OCM in that perspective.
I think that vision that you talked about is like a direct correlation to your case for change, right? Is part of your why behind your OCM activities too, that we talked about in another episode. But I do think that's a huge piece, right? That's always a starting point. Ron, anything that you'd add there?
I love what Naomi said, and I've worked with her on several of these projects where she has been the instigator of getting the state or the client to come up with some guiding principles that actually drive that vision. And again, like Naomi just said, you can always point back to those, like people say, that way down the road, why are we doing this? What's the point of this? And you go back to, here's why. Here are the guiding principles we all developed together. Remember these? I've been 6 months ago, but this is why it's important. And so people do understand the why, and they are bought into the process. They understand we've looked at alternatives, and it's just such a great process that is in place as long as it's followed. And I think we'll probably talk some about that later, but there are times when they're not followed, and some of the pitfalls you can get into. But as far as just communicating the change early, as far as OCM goes, and getting your change agents who buy into the guiding principles and the vision to help you push that change out and be champions.
Love it. And yeah, Naomi taught me that too. So, okay, well, let's look at the next kind of phase in these projects. So after you get through the planning phase, you then move into the procurement phase. So what is it that these three activities do to help ensure success in the procurement phase in your experience?
Well, I think it helps to open the doors to different options. It helps to identify pain points that you don't want to repeat. I think a lot of this is, we're saying the kind of same types of things, but as Naomi said a couple of times, planning is just so important to go ahead and make sure you understand the path forward and the objectives and what's guiding you, those guiding principles.
Something I didn't say earlier, which I really wanted to kind of emphasize. If you are able to spend even 3 years in planning before you get to the project. Now, I know that doesn't comport to the agile world we're in today, but starting your process, knowing how you're going to even communicate it, knowing how you're going to build resources. Very often there's a huge aspect of building and accessing and acquiring resources dedicated to the project, which the planning phase also allows you to do, right? Which makes all the other phases go much smoother because folks are not doing 3 different jobs. That's something we've seen, all across the spectrum where states or clients have not been able to do that. And some of them have because they started very early in the request process in their budgeting cycle to ask for those resources. I think that's an element of this that is kind of fits into, arguing to do a planning much earlier if you can start it earlier. And then it actually will feed into those subsequent phases.
I agree with both of you. I think the other thing that I love so much about those specific activities and planning is that they build upon themselves and you can use everything from those 3 activities in the procurement, right? So like the front half of an alternatives analysis is like the front chapter of a procurement. The market research goes directly into usually requirements or outcomes, and BPR would go into requirements or outcomes as well, or at least an attachment, right, to allow vendors to understand more about what it needs to do, and so that you get better responses and better pricing. And so I think sometimes clients look at it as like, oh, that's an extra phase, extra time, extra cost, but it's saving time and costs in the other phases down because you're using that material over and over again.
And you're actually able to understand like when you're doing a procurement, another huge part of it is the budget and getting those budgeting tables in place. And if you've done that early as well from the knowing what resources you're going to be asking for, if you already have that lined up, how much easier is it to do that procurement, right?
Exactly. Okay, well, next one would be implementation. So either design and development or actually like configuring a system. So looking at that phase, what is it about those 3 planning activities help ensure success in implementation phase?
Frankly, I'm going to toot our own horn here. Yeah. Public knowledge does an alternatives analysis process where we literally have so much input that a lot of it, the procurement and the implementation path is written for you, if you will. So, for example, thinking about all the risks, all the different ways that something could, be impacted. So, if you've considered risks for implementation or for testing, or for the alternative has, said this could be mostly a configured system because that's one of our guiding principles. All those things, whether that's true, however that pans out in your alternatives analysis, forms the path or the roadmap, if you will, for implementation and understanding the various phases of implementation, design, development, implementation. Then there's obviously as part of that, there's testing. If you're doing a configurable system, maybe your motto is, I want an off the shelf system, right? Or basically that's already able to be configured. And so if you come off the alternatives analysis process and you procured what you wanted to procure from that process, now you're in implementation and you don't even have to wait for the vendor to be on board to have a roadmap and understanding of how that path is going to go. But you're able to kind of understand what to expect ahead of time, which again helps you set your own resources in place and kind of get them lined up in a much more orderly fashion where you don't feel like you're chasing the ball down the road.
And to add to that, or just to dive into that a little bit, I guess, the criteria that we help or facilitate the client in developing for the alternatives, right? The alternatives are based, they're going to be weighted and scored based on what's most important to them. And that's what we call criteria. So we develop criteria and rank and score those. So yeah, if ease of configurability is one of the criteria, or if it's just, is cost an overriding concern, exactly right. Those feed right into your procurement and right into the rest of the process. So it all starts with that wonderful process that I've learned here at PK, which is the alternatives analysis.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing that I would add is on the BPR. If you've done that work early on, I think that implementation phase goes quicker too, because all of that's already documented, right? It's right there. So you have less time from your staff that's needed to like sit in rooms and talk through things. And there might be areas that the vendor wants to dig in more deeply. But if you've actually done a really thorough, good BPR, most of that is already documented. And so it's going to make it faster for the vendor, which is going to cost you less. And it's also going to be less time on your staff, like sitting in design sessions and configuration sessions.
It also helps you set up like the test cases. I know so many times in early parts of my career where we were actually involved in kind of developing test cases, you have to have something in front of you to know what you're testing, right? And frankly, a good documentation with on business process is super helpful for doing that. So vendors are ahead of the game on that. They're not just throwing out random standardized test cases that may not connect to what your operation is all about.
Yeah, and if your requirements are based on outcomes, how easy is that? This is what your goal is, this outcome, and you can test right to it. So you're exactly right.
All right, well, let's look back at some of the projects that you've had, and we're not going to share specific projects or clients, but I do want to talk about some lessons learned. So, what are some lessons learned that you could share with our audience about times when either there wasn't enough time spent on planning, no time spent on planning, the wrong activities occurring then? Like, what advice would you give to listeners if you could redo some of those?
You hit one, like the biggest one that I see repeated, I mean, almost every time is the client does not understand how heavy a procurement is on their staff. And every lessons learned that we've ever developed was we should have backfilled, we should have hired more people, we should have somehow given support to all the people that are the subject matter experts that are having to give all of their time doing their 9 to 5 and then doing the procurement as well. And they burn people out. That's one of the biggest lessons learned that I just don't see corrected in any project, any procurement project I've worked on yet.
I mean, I think there's like a state that we worked with a while ago, maybe 10 years ago or so, and they're still having the project going on today. That's why I'm bringing this older project up. Is they really did a lot of strategic assessing and feasibility planning even before they got to a pure alternatives analysis to even ask for the funds and create their project. And so they were trying to figure out what is the best way to change our whole model of doing our systems, our enterprise. And they started with, having us do an environmental scan or market research report that took a lot of depth. Basically, we dug deep with vendors, having to go to some of the vendors and get data, and then other states, including kind of the funding partners. That ended up being a document that was actually asked for by many, many states and was very helpful. So, the value here is that we provided information that didn't just help the client, but actually was kind of a setting the stage of what is happening currently that's going to help anybody about to do this kind of project. The fact that that state went through that and then they did a, kind of a deep dive feasibility assessment, then did the process of determining their main path, and then did an alternatives analysis within that. That was a lot of planning time that actually, in contrast to another state that was doing the same thing with their enterprise, this state had success. They actually successfully implemented and they use those systems, and now they're already in cycle 2 of that successfully. And I know I've seen another state struggle with the systems being successful because they didn't do that same process of really investing in that planning and getting to doing the BPR work as well. This was a state that actually asked us to help with the BPR documentation as well, and that I think at the time it felt so like amazing that they wanted to do that because we hadn't seen that a lot, but it actually paid off in many, many ways. So that was a really good lesson learned example.
And I'll say, Naomi and I have worked on a couple of these together. So I think when I say these, she's going to agree. But on 2 different procurements, and these were years ago, but we had the project sponsor and leadership basically, they had predetermined what was going to happen before we did the alternatives analysis or the market research or brought anything together as far as the guiding principles. And so really all that work was beautiful and everybody that was involved in it loved it. But in the end, it didn't matter because they already knew what the solution was going to entail. So I would have serious talk, I think, with the sponsor if and when this happens again.
Yeah, actually, Ron, you're hitting on one that was going to be mine. Is one of the projects that we worked on. We were involved doing OCM after they already made the decision of what to purchase and they already had the vendor on board. But when we got on board and started like working through what the case for changes and what the plan was, we realized they really did absolutely no planning other than the sponsor saying, this is what we're going to purchase and this is how you're going to use it. Mm-hmm. And, now go do. And I think it was a very challenging project all along and really never caught on and sat around like working very hard, lots of people working very hard on it, but it never actually got finished. And I think if I look back on that project, I would bet that is why, right? Is because they didn't do that, right? Exactly, Ron. Like they didn't come in, they didn't look at what the alternatives were, they didn't get the buy-in, they weren't clear about what was out there and why they were doing it. And then when we got involved, it's hard to like fill that in, right? If you didn't do it, like you didn't do it. And it's really hard to fix that down the road because then the vendor's already on, you've already procured what you want, but you have all of these leaders who are saying, this isn't what we want. This isn't what we need. We're not on the same page. And the vendor's still trying to build the thing and meet all their deliverables while the team was just swirling about this is not it. This isn't it. What do we do? It's pretty impossible and it doesn't work very well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and something I've seen also, which is a little bit of a different nuance, is that criteria process that Ron talked about, where we're essentially understanding what's most important in the decision making process for whatever the circumstances are. If everybody isn't even on the same page with that, like many years ago, also worked with an organization where they essentially said they knew they wanted to develop their own system to do something. They knew they wanted to. That was what they said they wanted to do. They developed the procurement around that. They got a vendor and the vendor came in and said, you know what, we're going to sell you our system instead. And you're going to want that instead. And so it ended up being right. Okay, they got a system that worked. But the point is, if they were able to have a better stand on what was important to them and understand why what was important to them was, why the solution for doing the reasoning that they wanted to build their own system wasn't necessarily the strongest, kind of leg at the table. And so understanding, kind of really thinking about that, not just bringing that like from a voice of one sponsor or one executive decision maker, letting that be essentially this process works. Literally, you're asking the questions, you're getting input, you're getting folks assessing qualitatively, and then you apply quantitative, kind of rankings to that. It literally works as a process to give you not only a consensus, but really usually in 99.9% of the cases, the best decision. If we are able to, in that case, they didn't do that. And they had a little bit of a delay and way more cost than they expected.
Yeah, and getting that, I've always been shocked doing this, that starting with a group that's in wildly different places and they're very passionate about which option they want. And by the end, seeing everyone come, I mean, it really is magical. It works. And it does build consensus, even though you look at the beginning and think, oh man, we're never going to get this. Yeah. This is never going to get accomplished. It always does. So.
And you can use it for simple life decisions too. You can apply this to your personal life.
Yeah.
Easily.
Well, it's actually interesting. We have used that same alternatives analysis process in non-systems projects when they were like looking at different alternatives for how to change a program or implement a new law. But it is a pretty amazing process when it comes to systems. Okay, what has surprised you the most about your journey or your client's journey through change, if you look back over time?
If I look at DITTA, our project management methodology, how it really applies, how easy it is, I guess, to apply these processes and activities to DITTA or vice versa. It is pretty amazing how you get a good team together, you support that team, you have repeatable processes. We're talking about this process. It's very repeatable and it's very successful. I think that's what's eye-opening to me is just the maturity that we have in our processes. And I guess I feel like I'm kind of novice because I've only been here a few years and I'm still kind of peeling the onion on all the things that PK has developed over the years. But that to me is just really, really eye-opening and pretty cool.
Naomi, what about you? What surprised you most about your journey or your client's journey through change?
Yeah, you sort of tapped into it, Stacey, which is the fact that you can get consensus from a group that is so far apart. And I actually remember the moment and the project and the state and the actual nuance the very first time I walked away going, wow, that is magic. And it was just taking everybody through. And what was really key to making that work is we did bring some environmental scan data to the table ahead of time. So you say, here's what the world is right now in this area of this program. Here are different options. Here are the different types of systems that are out there. We are big believers of bringing some of that information, even if it's not required as a separate task. We will bring some environmental scans, some data to the table, literally data if we can, around the options, because the more data you have. So the fact is that we were able to get that. It wasn't necessarily asked for, but we brought that to the table. That was extremely helpful to get people on the same page. And the consensus process with, at the end of the day, not only just a decision, for an alternative, but this group actually came up with a tagline for it and a description, which is wordsmithing with a bunch of people. And that's hard, but it worked really well because we used our process. And, we're not trying to withhold on this podcast about the process. It is a magical process, taking alternatives, pros and cons, getting people to invest some time in reviewing that, and then doing a first pass at their kind of thought process on that, and then bringing it together. I guess what surprised me is that consensus is absolutely possible, even when you don't think it is. And the fact that it's so important to make the project successful later on. I know visionary leaders are great and they have opinions, but when you have consensus, it's much more successful because people are just going to go forward with the same path.
Well, and probably more important than consensus is it's a better decision, right? Like better
Yes.
decision
Yeah.
making. Because we know that we know these projects are complex, right? And the decision is complex and there's a lot of data. And so if you can get multiple brains, right, on that data and on those options and get them all to agree, then you're pretty much guaranteeing that you've made the best decision that you can possibly make, right, in that moment. And I think that is so important to the success of the project in every phase after, is that the right decision was made. And I think the three of us could probably point to a bunch of projects where the right decision wasn't made, right? And then you're trying to fix it in every phase along the way. And that's so challenging if it's the wrong decision to begin with. Okay, well, before we conclude, let's take a little look at leadership. I'd love to get your insights about leadership and leading change. So, what is your advice for leaders that are navigating the complexities of change in today's world?
Essentially, don't feel pressured to make a decision fast. Take the time. I'm notoriously known for being like that person. Like, people are like, Naomi, what are you doing? I'm pondering, I'm thinking, I'm conceptualizing. Take that time to do that, because if you're able to come to the table as a leader with your thoughts well articulated, or at least where you're standing, you're going to be able to have conversations more as a leader that you want to show up as. I also think don't be afraid to kind of get the data out there, get data and ask what other folks are doing. I'm just going to say, take the time to do the planning and get the data. And really also communicate. Have that clear vision and communicate it, and tell people that their input is important. But let them know at the end of the day that, the executive leadership is going to set that strategy based on that input. That's really important.
That's such good advice, Naomi. And I'm also just reflecting on, I move fast and I feel like an urgency, and I'm like, huh, and it used to be that I felt like I had to make decisions immediately. And it's actually something that you and Jim, our old boss, taught me, was like the benefit of slowing down. And I saw it modeled in both of you so many times over the last decade or decade and a half. But it's a good balance for my personality that wants to go, 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 go. So good reminder. Ron, what advice would you give to leaders about navigating change today?
I guess I should have been taking notes because I loved everything Naomi said. But one of the other things that really hit home for me since joining PK that I really had not taken into account in my previous career as, developing systems and taking requirements and testing is the end user and the lived experience input that really should shape how our systems work and how they interact with the people that rely on them. So that would be one, is as you're making the decisions, as you're bringing the input in and hopefully taking really good note of what the input is from everybody and making the decisions, that those are the people most impacted by these systems. And that's who you need to listen to. And then, yes, do your OCM early, and your constant communication. I mean, those are the two key things to me in making sure that you've got success. Nobody likes to have a change thrown upon them, but if they're part of making the decisions and seeing the data and why, quantitatively how we came to this decision that this is our path forward, you get the buy-in that you wouldn't believe, and then you can be successful.
Aaron, I love that you brought up the kind of ultimate user or the purpose of the system, because I do think it is something that's often forgotten in the IT space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Is that there are people using the system that are benefiting from the system, that lives are affected by the system.
Right.
And it is I remember I was so proud of this client, but one of the guiding principles with one of our teams was that the child will always be at the center of all decision making on that project. And we actually had like a visual of that, like a circle with a kid in it that was part of every meeting and every conversation around that project. And I think that's a great reminder of like getting back to the why. And it's part of your case for change and communication and getting people on board. If you can connect it to what that system is for, right? And the ultimate beneficiary of it, it's so much easier to get buy-in and to lead
And
that change.
and keep that image as a vision in every one of your meetings. Have that posted somewhere. Put that out there, because I guess sometimes you develop these great guiding principles and great reasons and rationale, and then you move to the next step, and that gets lost. But that needs to still be in the forefront of why are we doing this, right? And keep pointing back to that and realizing that that's why.
I actually was working with a client once, and they were doing a big system change during a major kind of change in healthcare delivery. And they actually wrote their vision and their kind of those kind of guiding principles on the wall. I mean, this is when people went to the office, they wrote them on the wall. They were on the wall when you go to the bathroom. I mean, they were everywhere. And the fact that is, if we see that's, I mean, that's true. That's a key element of change.
Yeah.
Just being really bold about that is great.
Okay, my last question is still along the line of leadership. How can leaders empower their teams to innovate and adapt in times of uncertainty?
I love this one. I'm going to jump right in. So, and I've seen this work in a place that I was with when I wasn't a consultant, is literally let everyone offer suggestions for improvements.
Mhm.
The folks on the ground floor, if you will, the kind of the workers, the people kind of touching the day-to-day operations, they know how to improve things. Let them have a path to suggest improvements and test them out. And you don't have to be panicky about whether we should do it or not. Let them test it out. And if it works, then expand it, and then expand it some more. Like incrementally kind of offer, opportunity for folks to suggest change is a really big one, I think, in terms of being able to kind of enlist your team, your people, and get them, on board and really get the best of their skills.
And what you made me think of is another PK value in that diversity and building a diverse team is how you get the best input to decisions. And so build your team as a diverse team, educate them, let them be in on all these activities we're doing, as the elements that we just discussed today with the alternatives analysis and all the information we're gaining from our market research, and then seek input from them. And then I think Naomi touched on that again. You can't necessarily have them all be decision makers. There's usually way too many stakeholders, but use their input to make a good decision.
I truly appreciate both of you for sharing your insights and your lessons learned today. It's been inspiring. Any final thoughts? Anything else that you'd like to share?
Spending time planning is going to pay off in the end. And I'm sure there's data around that can be used to justify the expense that you spend on planning, but don't hesitate to kind of do it. And planning isn't, it has a lot of things, because it really tracks to what Ron mentioned earlier about the lived experience. We did have a project where that was another element of an input before we got to the alternatives analysis, was doing kind of analysis of all different kind of stakeholders who are impacted, including a representation of the group of the folks who are impacted by the system and the program. And that frankly was eye-opening. We are seeing that more and more being a focus in the space that we're in the human services area. I think it's really being kind of elevated more and emphasized. So I want to encourage that, and I'm really excited about that.
I will just add, we do all this work as teams at Public Knowledge. And man, when I first joined the firm, I really did not like the icebreakers. I mean, I got kind of antsy when we got into meetings and we were not getting to the meeting. Let me just say, from an old guy who's been around in system work for a long time, to me, icebreakers and having individual targeting with people and getting to know who you're working with is so dang important to having a good team and a successful team, and a team that is accountable and cares for each other. I guess outside of the realm of the topic we're on, but you can't do this work without a good team and without good team members, and that's I guess what I would add at the end here.
Yeah, it's so true. Like the smartest person in the world can't do this work alone. Like they just can't. It's not possible. Well, thank you guys. What a privilege it's been to be with you today, to connect, to learn, to grow, to breathe, and to share. Until next time.